Hi everybody! Today we're going to be discussing the imagery debate and exploring the intersection of mental imagery, visual imagery, and perception. So first we'll start off with some basic concepts. What is mental imagery? Mental imagery is the ability to create or recreate sensory experiences in one's mind in the absence of sensory input. Let's try an example. Close your eyes and imagine standing on the beach. What do you feel? What do you see? And what do you hear? If you felt sensations like the sand on your feet, the sound of the waves, the smell of the salt, the heat from the sun, then congratulations, you are engaging in mental imagery. Next, let's go to visual imagery. Visual imagery is a subset of mental imagery that involves the sense of having pictures or images in the mind despite no current physical interaction with the stimulus or object. Let's try an example. Imagine your favorite t-shirt. What do you see? If you were thinking about the color, the texture, the shape, the stitching, the fabric, the design, the details, the length, and so on, congratulations, you are engaging in visual imagery. Next, let's go to perception. What is perception? Perception is the process of interpreting and organizing sensory information from the environment to create meaningful experiences. Sensory information is information received from your senses. This includes sound, smell, sight, touch, and taste. What does perception have an influence on? The first is understanding the environment. Perception allows us to understand and recognize objects, peoples, events, and places, and make sense of the relationships between them. Here are some examples of daily life interactions. Recognizing people's faces, navigating our environment and how to get from one place to another, detecting possible danger or threats, looking for your car in a crowded parking lot. The second thing perception has an influence on is decision-making. Our perceptions shape our understanding of the world. How we interpret certain situations influences the choices we make and our behavior. For example, if we perceive a situation as pleasant or pleasurable, we are more likely to react with engagement and continuous interaction. However, if we perceive a situation as harmful or threatening, we are more likely to react with defensive action, such as fighting, or defensive mechanisms, such as fleeing or avoiding the situation entirely. The next thing perception has an influence on is communication and nonverbal cues. We depend on perception to allow us to perceive and interpret social cues. These include facial expressions and body language. And this allows us to understand and appropriately respond and interact during conversations or just our daily lives. Perception also has a few other roles in this sort of concept, and that's language processing and comprehension. The fourth thing perception has an influence on is memory. Our perceptions help us encode. And remember, encoding is the first step in memory formation process, wherein you take in and store information from our past experiences. Our perceptions help us encode and allow us to remember information about the world around us. An example of that is we are more likely to remember details about a scene if we have perceived it clearly. So, if we have little details or we have perceived it not very clearly, such as seeing something right after waking up in the morning, seeing something at a far distance, seeing something flash through quickly or with a blurry view, we're likely to remember it less than if we were to perceive it with more details, such as high-focused environment or high-attention situations where you're really honed in on what you're observing. Emotional event or experience associated to it, we're more likely to remember something that has an emotional association or attachment to us. We are also more likely to remember if we are actively maintaining and processing the information. Next is the imagery debate. What is the imagery debate? The imagery debate is a long-standing argument over whether mental imagery is spatial or propositional representation. Let's go deeper into the imagery debate. The main theorists arguing were Stephen Koslin for the spatial representation theory and Zenon Pychlin, sorry if I'm incorrectly pronouncing that, and his argument was the propositional representation theory. So what were they arguing? The spatial representation theory's main idea is imagery is spatial. It states that the brain uses mental maps or representations to understand and navigate the spatial relationships between objects and locations in the environment. So what does that mean? The brain constructs a mental model of the space around us. Think of a map. This allows us to keep track of where objects are in relation to each other and to ourselves. The representations have characteristics of physical objects, such as spatial, rather than only symbols or language. How is it organized? This mental map is thought to be organized in a hierarchical manner, with larger spatial units, such as rooms or buildings, containing smaller units, such as objects or furniture, to put it into a metaphor that might be easier to understand. Next, the propositional representation theory. The main idea was that relationships between objects are represented by symbols, not by spatial mental images of the scene. It stated that mental images do not show us how the mind works. Rather, they indicate that something is happening. Instead, this theory suggests that mental images are stored in the brain as abstract propositions or descriptions. Propositions meaning the smallest possible entity of information. These propositions are composed of symbols that represent the features and attributes of the subject or scene being imagined and the relationships between them. Let's look at an example of how propositional representation works. Imagine a red apple on a table. This theory would represent this through the propositions of, there is an apple, the apple is red, the apple is on a table. So what's the process behind this theory? This theory suggests that mental imagery is not necessarily dependent on sensory experience or perception, but rather on the ability to manipulate and combine abstract representations in the mind. Research and studies. For spatial representation theory, we have Coslin's mental scanning task. This is an experimental technique that has been used to support the spatial representation theory and depictive nature of imagery. For the procedure, participants are presented with the visual image of a familiar object, such as a map or a house. They are then asked to mentally imagine this object and focus on a specific feature, such as a window or a particular location on the map. Next, they are instructed to mentally scan the image in order to locate another feature, such as a door or a different location on the map from the previous one. During this mental scanning process, participants are asked to press a button as soon as they locate the second feature. The time it takes for participants to complete the mental scanning task is then recorded and analyzed. They are specifically looking for the latency between the time that it takes to scan from one location or object to another. The results. They found that the time it takes to complete the task is influenced by the distance between the 2 points, and that people are faster at mentally scanning shorter distances than longer distances. So what does this tell us about mental images? Mental images are represented in the brain in a way that is similar to how physical objects are represented in space. In basic terms, mental imagery is organized in a spatially constructed way. It demonstrates that we use the same neural mechanisms for mental imagery that we use when we perceive and navigate the physical world. Some studies done for the propositional representation theory are the mental rotation task. Participants were presented with pairs of three-dimensional objects and asked to judge whether they were the same or different. Some pairs of objects were identical, while others were rotated versions of the same object. The results. Reaction times were proportional to the degree of rotation required to match the two objects, indicating that mental images were being mentally rotated to make the comparison. This finding suggested that mental images were not stored as exact visual copies, but rather as abstract propositions that could be manipulated in the mind. So which is it? First, let's take a step back and go back to perception. So what do perception and mental imagery have to do with each other? A whole lot. Some similarities between imagery and perception are that they both rely on the same neural mechanisms in the brain, such as the visual system. The same areas of the brain are activated when we imagine a visual image versus when we actually see that image. Mental imagery can influence perception. Studies have shown that imagining a visual image before seeing it in reality can improve perceptual performance and make it easier to recognize the images. Similarly, visual illusions can be affected by mental imagery. The brain's interpretation of sensory information can be influenced by top-down processes that are shaped by prior knowledge and mental representations. Some other similarities between perception and mental imagery are that they both involve the brain's processing of sensory information. Imagery neurons respond to both perceiving and imagining, and visual information is often encoded through the use of mental imagery. So, what's the verdict? Imagery is spatial, and It shares mechanisms with our perceptual processes. However, we still cannot fully rule out propositional representation explanations for all results. So why is mental imagery important to the field of cognitive science? Understanding mental imagery provides important insight for various cognitive processes and understanding underlying mechanisms of cognitive function. 5 ways mental imagery can give insight. Understanding perception. Mental imagery can help us understand how perception works by revealing the processes that underlie the way we interpret and make sense of sensory information. Investigating memory. Mental imagery can provide insights into how we encode, store, and retrieve memories, as well as how we construct past experiences in the mind. Exploring problem solving. Mental imagery can help us understand how we use mental representations to solve problems and make decisions, and how we use visualization to plan and anticipate future actions. Studying language. Mental imagery can help us understand how language comprehension and production rely on the ability to create and manipulate mental representation of concepts and ideas. Developing therapies. Mental imagery can be used as a tool for developing therapies for a range of mental health conditions, such as anxiety disorders and phobias, by helping individuals to create and manipulate mental images to overcome negative thoughts and emotions. Some key takeaways are imagery is spatial, imagery and perception rely on the same neural processes, the imagery debate, and imagery reveals a lot about how our brain works and the underlying cognitive processes.